Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, buddy, and welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. It's time for Sunday School. That gigantic thud you heard in the background was my 110-pound St. Bernard flopping on the floor. We are in Wisconsin. This is being recorded live from my father's kitchen. As it happens, it's my dad's birthday this weekend, and my sister got engaged. So we made a surprise trip out for some celebrations. But, of course, we must continue on with the show. Sunday School must go on. So here we are. I got a wonderful email that I think is going to be a perfect jumping off point for our conversation today. So let me start by reading that, and we'll go from there. I'm going to keep the writer of this letter anonymous for now, but here's the message. He writes, "A little while ago, you read a passage from Mere Christianity about pride. At first, I was thinking, oh, please, don't just read to us, but something resonated." So, believe me, I had the same hesitation here. He continues, "The passage was well written, and I enjoyed the flow of it, but as I was listening, I was reminded of some of my own struggles regarding religion and my own shortcomings. Anyway, after that podcast, I got a copy of the book and read it before you explored the other chapters, and listening to those podcasts after having read the book was really great. I will certainly read more of his work," referring to C.S. Lewis, "and wanted to let you know that though I was skeptical at first, your readings were great, and I hope you continue to do more. I will certainly go back to listen to some of your religious podcasts, discuss religious beliefs, while so many people are negative about them. I have often been on the fence, and I think the one of the daunting things about being a good Christian is that God's expectations are so high. Part of me always felt like, why bother? It may sound silly, but Mere Christianity reminded me of what should probably be obvious. It is not supposed to be easy." This is a first, thank you. This is very heartwarming, and obviously it makes me smile to hear this. It's a wonderful wonderful joy to me always to see how much resonance we get with these Sunday School episodes and the religion-based podcasts, and how much people are getting away from these. One of the very surprising statistics of my podcast is that the Sunday School and the religious-themed episodes now consistently outperform every other topic that we talk about. More than the business, more than the fitness, more than writing, nutrition. It's really amazing. So it tells me that there's something here, which, of course, having gone through this myself, there's that the soul's upward yearning, right? There's something there that we all know we can't get from this world here and now, right? There's something in us that has desires that cannot be satiated by anything material, by anything natural. Our desires are really infinite. So at any point that we try to satisfy our infinite desires with finite things, we're always going to be frustrated. And of course, this is a deep insight that has been shared and argued for by many philosophers and many religious people, not just Christian, saying, hey, look, we have these infinite desires for perfect love, perfect beauty, perfect truth, and perfect home, yet we can't seem to satisfy any of these perfect infinite desires here on earth, so it seems like there must be something more. And it's kind of suggestive. It's a clue more than a airtight analytic philosophical argument. But you realize, okay, wherever there's a want or a desire for a finite thing, we typically find it. We get hungry, there's food. We want to procreate, there's sex, and so on and so forth. But there's these transcendental desires as well. Again, for perfect beauty, love, justice, home, friendship, that we cannot perfectly fulfill, at least not in this life. So what is that telling us? It's saying that we're kind of meant for something more, and friendship that we cannot perfectly fulfill, at least not in this life. So what is that telling us? It's saying that we're kind of meant for something more, and that's why in life it's so important not to settle for less. That's why in life it's so important to seek a religious life, to understand that we are meant for so much more, and all the finite goods are fine, and they can be goods. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the finite things of this world, but in their proper proportion. But if you think that money alone will make you happy, or or honor alone, or power alone will make you happy, you will always be frustrated. And that's one of the great religious truths, certainly of the Christian religion, but it's shared among many different religious and philosophical traditions, because I think it is obvious. It's not supposed to be easy. Now, I think there's a lot we can say about this. And I'm going to say as much as I think needs to be said, so we can get our thinking right about what God's expectations are, what our role is in man's response to God. I should have brought the catechism with me. It was such a last-minute trip. There's a wonderful passage in the Catholic Catechism about this, what role human freedom plays, and what God is really doing with us. So I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to get it out of our head that God has just set forth some arbitrary set of rules that he wants us to follow because it just somehow pleases us, that he wants us to be polite or well-behaved, just because these things are arbitrary, that he laid down the commandments and what have you, and he sets all these high expectations just because he's just kind of, he's kind of a stuffy guy, good old God is. And that is, I think that's a very, and I'm not saying that the listener has this conception. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that this is a common misconception that people have, is that they see God as some kind of stuffy old traditionalist, right? He needs to get with the times. But that's the wrong way to see it. What God is love. In Christian theology, God is a Trinity. He is somehow mysteriously and amazingly relational. He is three self-reflective acts of understanding, sharing in one perfect and absolutely simple divine substance. It's an incredible thing to think about. Now, the Trinity is not something that you can reason to. It's not. It just isn't. St. Thomas Aquinas made this very clear. He says you can reason to God. Now, the Trinity is not something that you can reason to. It's not. It just isn't. St. Thomas Aquinas made this very clear. He says you can reason to God's existence and you can reason to God's attributes, meaning apart from revelation, just through good, consistent, deductive thinking, starting with simple facts about the world, like contingent things existing. You can deduce that there must exist some unconditioned, non-contingent reality that is absolutely simple, that has no restrictions or boundaries. And through the principle of proportionate causality, we can see that whatever this foundation is of reality, it must have within itself, either formally, virtually, or eminently, all these things that we see in the world. So it must be the ultimate source of goodness, of love, of truth, of beauty, of intelligence, of will, and so on and so forth. So all these things must be rooted and found and grounded in God. Now, the fact that God also happens to be a Trinity is a revealed truth. It's not something that we can figure out philosophically. It's something that we can work through in philosophical theology to ensure that it's coherent. But there's nothing about the world we live in and through our powers of reasoning that we really could have deduced this. What we get through philosophy is this, the God of the philosophers. We can get to a moral monotheism, a God that is perfectly simple, has no restrictions or boundaries. And indeed, the Catholic Church affirms this about God. It's the doctrine of divine simplicity. It doesn't mean that God is impersonal. Absolutely not. That's a common misconception. It just means that God is the simplest possible metaphysical reality, that there's no intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries in God that would exclude any reality from God. And that just makes perfect sense, because if any reality was excluded from God, it wouldn't be a reality, because God is necessary for anything to be possible or really actual. So that the doctrine of divine simplicity is not only a deep metaphysical truth, it's really essential for an understanding of sort of the nature of God, whose essence is existence itself. Now, all that is kind of philosophical work, but then on top of that, we have certain revealed truths about God that we take on authority. Now, people sometimes get a little weirded out by authority, and believe me, I did as well before I became Catholic and a religious person. I was always a very libertarian-leaning, anti-authority and everything. So for me to go from that to a Catholic, somebody who takes the authority of the church, that was not an easy step for me. So I must have really believed, did become man, that God really did come to reconcile ourselves to him through the person of Jesus Christ, and that we have really good evidence that a really good historical case can be made, both based on prior probability, conditional evidence, and on-the-ground historical data for the resurrection. So once you have that, you have good reason to take the revelations of Christ on authority. So the point that I always want to keep pressing with this is that faith is and should be reasonable. And this is what Thomas Aquinas always affirmed, and that's why he was such a big influence on me. He says, look, all revelation, all truth, all reason, it all comes from the same source. It's all coming from God. So they can't conflict. They can't in principle come into conflict. If they do come into conflict, then you're doing something wrong. You're not reasoning in straight channels, or it's not an actual reliable revelation. So within Aquinas and within the Catholic tradition, there's always been this very deep necessary harmony between faith and reason. And once you have that, you can see that authority, it makes sense. And then you take from your starting point these revealed truths, and then you have a science from there. You're saying, okay, well, we know that God is a Trinity mysteriously. What can we then figure out from that? And that's what theology really is. Theology takes these starting points, these revealed truths as starting points, and then it tries to work things out from there in various different ways. So where philosophy starts from just, okay, what can we know through everyday experience, through thinking on our deep armchair, and we can know not only of God's existence, but certain attributes of God from there. Theology gives us a sort of a boost, if you will. It gives us a starting point that we might not have been able to reason to by ourselves, but is certainly reasonable once we can see where it's coming from. Just to get clear on these distinctions, because sometimes the lines can be blurred. Now, back to the original point. Once we coming to God's expectations, once we understand that both through philosophy and through revelation, that God is all good, all loving, and that that God is not some impersonal mechanistic substance, all right? He's also not some stuffy traditionalist dude. What God is relational. God really is love. It's not just some cliche to say that God is love. There's deep theological truth in this, in the very grounded nature of God being a Trinity. You have lover, you have beloved, and you have shared love, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's what it means. Now, to love is to will the good of the other. This is very important. I promise we're going to be getting to the tie-in here. Now, agape, as C.S. Lewis would call it. So if you want another C.S. Lewis book, check out Four Loves, where he goes through kind of some modern conceptions of love that are really misguided, where you think of romantic love or friendship love or love for coffee, which I'm drinking right now. And these really aren't love in the Christian sense, in what Christians mean by love. what Christians mean by love is willing the good of the other for other. And I think the best analogy that we can give of this is a sort of love that a parent has for a rebellious teenager, where the teenager is maybe a bit snotty, doesn't really want anything to do with the parent, want anything to do with the parent. It's kind of maybe mean, maybe now. Hopefully this isn't anybody's actual teenager, but I think for an extent it was certainly me growing up, being the brat that I was. And yet, what does the parent do? The parent keeps loving and willing what is good for that child, irrespective of that child's behavior and affection towards the parent. Maybe that child is exceptionally mean to the parent. It doesn't matter. The parent keeps on doing what they know is best for the child because they genuinely want what is best for the child. That's what love is. It is this absolutely outward giving, where it doesn't matter how it makes you feel. It doesn't matter what you get out of it. And I think that parental love is certainly, at least in my life, in my experience, the closest that I've ever experienced, the type of love that God has for us. Even romantic love, the type of love that God has for us. Even romantic love, relationship love doesn't always quite get there. Hopefully it does eventually, right? But a lot of times when we have romance, it's really the feelings we get from it that we talk about love. Like, we feel nice and warm and all that. But hopefully that will get to a point where you truly love your spouse so much that it doesn't matter about the feelings you get from it. What matters is what is good for them. That's love, willing the good of the other for other. Now, once you understand that this is what God is, and that God, and this is why the Our Father is so powerful. My favorite line in the Our Father is "Thy will be done," and sometimes I think "Thy loving will be done." Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be Thy name. Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done. Now, why should we want who God is, and that God can only will what is good for us, truly good for us? And that God knows what is truly good for us, and that God knows what is good for us more than we can ever know it. That's the key. That's the key. Between God's omnipotence and omniscience, He's a little bit more qualified than we are to tell us what is really good for us, how to live a happy life. Now, what does God want for us? Well, He wants us to have a loving, saving relationship with Himself. He wants us to have eternal friendship with Himself. Now, why does He want this? Well, because this is the most that He can possibly give us. And because God loves us, He wants to give us all that He possibly can. But anything in this world, in a material sense, money, honor, wealth, glory, power, none of those could ever make us as perfectly content, as perfectly happy, as eternal friendship with beatific vision, as we call it in Catholic philosophy. That's really what heaven is this loving, saving, communal relationship with God for eternity. Now, this is kind of hard for us to understand because in our kind of natural state, there is a degree of separation from God, and this goes back to the doctrine of the fall and the doctrine of original sin. So we have to have faith and a trust and an understanding, first kind of maybe from the head and then an assenting from the heart, to see that okay, what God really wants for us above anything, more than anything, and the only thing He really can want for us is to be perfectly and completely happy. Now, in order for us to be perfectly, completely happy, there's only, to satisfy this infinite desire, the only thing that God can give. God can only give what He can give. He can't give what He can't give. And the most of what He can give is Himself. The only thing that God can give, God can only give what He can give. He can't give what He can't give. And the most of what He can give is Himself, is the infinity and the perfect eternal friendship of Himself. Now, what do the technical details of that look like? I don't know. I really don't know. But I have faith and trust that whatever that is, it is going to be so much more perfectly fulfilling, so much more perfectly gratifying than anything here on this earth. And I know that that is what God wants to give me. He wants to give it to you. He wants to give it to all of us. So that's what God's expectations are. It's not that he just wants to behave a certain way because it makes him look good in front of his friends at dinner time. The reason God wants us to act a certain way is so we can develop morally to be the types of people, to be the types of moral agents that can be perfectly happy in a loving, saving relationship with God. If we are prideful people, if we are people that are so mired in narcissism and egoism, and all we want is ourselves, and we have no capacity for love, then we're not the types of people that are going to be satisfied in heaven. We're not. So what God is trying to do through the commandments, through the Beatitudes, through his grace, and we're going to get into this in a minute, because God doesn't expect us to do this on our own. In fact, we cannot do it on our own. God helps us to get it done. But what God is trying to do is to shape us into the types of people that are going to be receptive to a perfectly loving, saving, eternal friendship with God, that can have our perfect and complete happiness fulfilled through the beatific vision. Now, that is kind of trying to put this in its proper context, just to understand where God is coming from. God wants us to be happy. He wants to love us, and he wants us to love him, not because he needs it, not at all because he needs it, but because he knows that this is what is really good for us. And God knows what is really good for us way better than we in our finite capacity ever possibly could. Now, there's some things to kind of understand that I think can help make sense of this even more. Okay, so if the point of the highest point of existence really is love, and I think most people have an intuitive sense that it is, but Christianity boldly affirms this. And this is where Christianity differs from many of the classic philosophies and some other religions as well. In fact, a number of other religions. Many of the classic philosophers, including Plato, thought, the purpose of the highest virtue was justice. Christianity says, no, it's love. The purpose and meaning of that love is only really a valuable thing if it's freely chosen. If you're not choosing love, then it's not really love. You're just a puppet, right? And that isn't the type of thing that we would think of as a good thing. Love is something that is valuable when somebody really chooses to let go of their own self desires, their own narcissism, their own egotism, their own the world revolves around me attitude, and says, I'm going to give myself to this person because I love this person, and I genuinely care what is good for them. And that's why we think so highly of people who just make tremendous acts of self-sacrifice. We see sometimes even giving their own lives for the good of other people. And we think, wow, that is a maximally good thing. Now, once we understand that, we can see why that God has certain design restraints. Now, this is interesting to think about when it comes to creating the world. But God has certain design restraints. God can only do what is logically possible. So if love is sort of the goal, right, and it's a maximally good thing for free creatures to be able to choose love, this means that God had to make us free. If the goal is love, then he couldn't have just the point of our life here on earth is not for humans to just be a bunch of happy fat cows. That's not the point. The point is for us to learn to know and love God and to know and love each other. These are the two highest commandments that Christ gave us as clarity. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, everything you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, couldn't be more clear about that. But that means that we have to be able to choose love. But to be able to choose love, we also have to have a real possibility of not choosing love. So here is free will, and with free will comes very much the problem of evil. And when we look at evil and we look at the kind of immense suffering that people inflict on one another, what we realize is that evil is not a positive thing. I mean, obviously it's not a positive thing and a good thing, but evil ontologically is not something that has a positive status. It's not something that exists. Evil, when you really examine it, and this is one of St. Augustine's brilliant insights that actually led him away from a sort of Gnostic Manichaean tradition and into the Catholic Church. And Lewis highlights this in Mere Christianity as well, is evil is really a hole where goodness should be. Evil is a privation, we would say. More specifically, in humans, evil is an ignoring or an undermining for our capacity for love. Evil is an ignoring or an undermining for our capacity for love. When people do evil things, what they're doing is that they are pursuing things that in and of themselves aren't necessarily bad, like money or food or recognition among peers, but they do it in a way that is deeply morally confused, often at the expense of others. And that is because of an ignoring or an undermining for the capacity of love, whether that's stealing, cheating, lying, murdering. It's an ignoring or undermining for the capacity of love. It's a hole where there should be something there that isn't. And because it isn't there, we have this perverted behavior. And it leads to moral acts. And look, there should be something there that isn't. And because it isn't there, we have this perverted behavior. And it leads to moral acts. And look, there's a real positive ontology to punching somebody in the face, which is evil, especially an innocent person. But the reason that happens, when you really unpack it, is because of a hole or a lack of something that isn't there that should be. And that, of course, would be our actualizing a capacity for love, realizing that the people are ends in and of themselves, not means for you to just satisfy your own ego, you're trying to satisfy those finite, satisfy your infinite desires with finite goods. Now, free will is one of those design constraints where if God wanted to create a maximally good world, which he did, there's certain trade-offs that have to be made. And one of those trade-offs is that, look, if the reality of choosing love is going to be a reality, consider two, which I think are important. I'm just going to briefly touch on it now, and in future episodes we'll dive more deeply into what's known as the problem of pain or suffering, and we'll explore different theodicies that show why these things, even as horrible as they seem on the surface, really are serving the divine masterpiece. And the idea here is if we're going to have free creatures interact with one another, think of it as a game of checkers, right? If you're going to have two people play checkers, you need a fixed checkerboard and need a fixed set of rules. If people could play checkers just by changing the rules or the board every 5 seconds, you wouldn't be able to have any interaction. Well, same thing with souls in a material environment. In order for souls to be able to make decisions, for those decisions to be meaningful, in order to learn from those decisions, you need a stable playing field. You need a universe that seems probably just very much like ours, that operates according to fixed laws and regularities, where people can't just, work through miracles whenever they want and lift the consequences of their decisions or change their environment and just by thinking. Their interaction and moral development would be impossible in a world like that. Now, this is an important realization and another design constraint, because in a world with fixed regularities and laws, now we have the basis for a lot of natural suffering, meaning the fire that warms you can also burn you. The water that quenches your thirst can also drown you. So it's important to understand, because we do live in a world where a lot of bad stuff happens. And it isn't because God wants this bad stuff to happen or wills it. Rather, God simply permits it because he has morally sufficient reasons and we should all be able to understand this, especially in my life, where the times when I've learned and developed the most morally were oftentimes of great tragedy, true deep suffering in my life. And suffering can shock you out of superficiality. It gets you to really wake up spiritually and think, what really matters in life? So God does not will suffering, or evil. He can't. God is perfectly all good. He is He is the unactualized actualizer. He is the source and foundation for everything that exists. And to the extent that everything exists, it is good. It's when there's lacks or privations that evil and suffering set in. Now, God will allow these because he has morally sufficient reasons, because some greater good can be brought about through a more or less imperfect world. And of course, we can think of examples like this of things that are morally really good that help us to develop our capacity and expressions of love. Things like compassion. We could have things that are morally really good that help us to develop our capacity and expressions of love. Things like compassion. We couldn't have compassion unless there are situations for which we can be compassionate, where people are in need of compassion. And mercy. Mercy is another beautifully, wonderfully good thing. Justice. All these virtues and moral attributes that really help us to develop ourselves, our own character, and our expressions of love really seemed like they could only be possible in a world that isn't perfect. So there's sort of soul building going on is another way to think about it. So we live in a world not where the point is to be fat, contented, happy cows. That isn't God. God, of course, God could have done that, but there's something better. There's something so much better than that, and that is the free development and choosing of love. And God knows that, and that's what he wants for us. So he's helping us, and he's helping us in a lot of different ways. One, he helps us through revelation. He does not leave us alone in obscurity. He has specifically revealed himself. Now so much of what people have known about God, either before Christianity or outside Christianity, we would say comes from our soul's upward yearning, or the sensus divinitatis. Or Aquinas called, everybody has in us an innate capacity of a general and confused knowledge of God. But on top of this just basic intuition towards the divine, which we all have, you really have to be trained out of it. This is a very basic thing that is occasioned in people at a very young age. I've seen it in my kids. It's incredible. They come into the world with a sense that there's something more, that there's purpose, that there's design, that there's meaning. They don't come into the world with a fully developed knowledge of the Trinity and Christian doctrine, but they have this sensus divinitatis. And what we know is that God is here to help us along the way, and he does it through a number of means, but primarily grace, gifts. So we know through the incarnation and atonement that God is here to reconcile ourselves to him, and that through the merits of the atonement. By the way, I'm reading a new book on the atonement right now by Eleanor Stump, and I hear it's fantastic. I can't speak on it yet, but I'll probably have much more to say about the doctrine of the atonement in future episodes, as I've read many people on it, but I want to finish this book before I issue any further opinions. But it's through the merits of the atonement, right? Of that we find somehow amazingly this reconciliation between what seemed an impossible reconciliation. Because on one hand you have God who's perfectly just and perfectly merciful, and then on the other hand you have these creatures, us, who have more or less turned and spat in the face of God at some point along the line, and probably even in our own lives. So how do you reconcile? Like, that's the greatest offense that could possibly be, to turn and spit in the face of your Creator, the one that gives you everything that you have out of a love relationship. I mean, that's heinous stuff. When you really, really think about it, it's heinous stuff. How does God reconcile that? How do you be perfectly just and perfectly merciful in a situation like that? And then amazingly, not in a way that we could never even think about, we see how, and that is Christ on the cross. It is somehow the crucifixion, where God takes it upon himself to reconcile humanity to himself. And that's the wonderful mystery of the atonement. And the one thing that all Christians agree on, they don't agree on how exactly it works. There's very different theories of the atonement. There's a satisfaction theory. There's this theory that Eleanor Stump is developing, which is kind of in line with that, which is classic in the Catholic tradition. Aquinas was along those lines. You have penal substitution theory. There's many different theories on the kind of technical details of how exactly it worked. But what Christians agree on is that it did work. It did something that really did bring us back into the possibility, at least, for a loving, saving relationship with God. It somehow satisfied that perfect mercy and perfect justice. Now, once we understand and perfect justice, once we understand that it's through the merits of the atonement of Christ's sacrifice for us that our salvation is not earned. And this is actually a common misunderstanding about Catholic theology. Many people think that Catholics think you kind of have to work your way to heaven, right? You have to put so many dollars in the collection bin, or you have to do so many good deeds a day, and it's a bunch of tally marks, and if you have more good tally marks than bad, then you go to heaven. That is a complete caricature of Catholic. That Catholics have never, ever said that. Catholics say this. This is what Catholics say, and this is what part attracted me so much to the Catholic side, is that everything we get in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of eternal friendship with God, is merited through Christ. There's nothing we can do to earn that. Not a single thing we can do to earn that. That is a gift. But Catholics affirm that there is still a role to play, a human role of cooperation with accepting that gift, with accepting God's will for us. And mysteriously, there is God's grace on one hand that is working within us to shape us, to help us in our moral development, to bring us to eternal friendship with Him. But there's also the role of human free will, where we have to go along with this. We have to assent. We have to cooperate. And that is really, in short, the doctrine of works in Catholic theology. Is not that we earn eternal friendship with God. It's not that we like literally tally mark our way into heaven. It's that there's this relationship of God's respect for human freedom, because freedom is, of course, a good thing, right? We don't want to affirm that we don't have freedom or we have no role to play in this, but at the same time, we can't do it on our own. Sad is, these seem like high expectations, but what we have to realize is God doesn't expect us to do it on our own. He's helping us. And I will personally attest to this in my life, that since becoming Catholic, it has been enormously, like when I first became Catholic, I just like looked at the huge list of things of my life, of my characters, traits, and things that were so out of line with Catholic teaching and Christian living. And I thought, how am I ever going to even get close to this? But somehow I did. Amazingly, I did. And it was because I assented. I said, I obviously prayed a ton. And I said, God, I believe that this is true. Help me to live the type of life that you want me to live. Help me to be the type of person you want me to be. And through prayer, through living the sacraments, things changed in my life that I know for a fact I could never have changed on my own. I just probably guess, we all have our stuff, and I'm by so not perfect at all. So yes, God is high in his expectations, but he's extremely high, unlimited in his mercy and his forgiveness as well. So there's always that beautiful balance there, right? High in standards, high in mercy. That's at least what the Catholic tradition, affirms. So we make, a couple steps forward, we take a couple steps back, we take a couple more steps forward, but God is there, he's helping us. And human free will has a role to play. And it's a great thing. Now, actually, not all Christians agree with this. Martin Luther rejected it. That was one of his big revolt points with the Catholic Church. He said, I don't want free will. It's all through the workings of grace. And same thing, Calvin, even later on, kind of affirmed this and even more, or I would say denied it, denied the Catholic position in an even more radical sense, where he thought that there's this elect pool of people that that God has. And on those people, God's grace is irresistible. I had the idea of irresistible grace. There's nothing they can do to resist it or turn away. And that there's everybody else to reprobate, and it's like, too bad. Now, that to me, and I'm sorry if there's any Calvinists listening, but I cannot reconcile that position with an all-loving God. That seems to me like wrong theology. But I worked my way because I started leaning Protestant before I became Catholic. So I studied all these Protestant theologians, Luther and Calvin, and sort of the people who were very early on. And I thought, man, these just don't seem quite right. And then I got to the Catholic position on it that affirms mysteriously. It doesn't try to say. The Catholic Church has been very careful. Doesn't try to say. The Catholic Church has been very careful not to try and work out all the details of how God's grace works with human freedom. But it doesn't really have to. It just solidly affirms both, that we have God's gift, his inner workings within us, and the merits of Christ, and at the same time we have our own role to play, our own cooperation with that. And the Catholic Church says that this is how it works. That's how it works, and everybody, every human is extended. Is extended the grace of God, the merits of Christ, Christian or not. Everybody is extended this grace. Now the Catholic Church will say, like, look, you're like, part of becoming Catholic is to live the sacramental life. So the one other big thing about the Catholic Church, there's a lot of big things about it, is that it says that, hey, look, God works through stuff now just as He worked through stuff. Hey, look, God works through stuff now just as He worked through stuff back then. Right, so we have these sacraments, specifically the Eucharist, the real presence of the Eucharist, and that was another big thing that caused me to become Catholic. Is when I studied the early church. First off, it seemed extremely biblical to me, especially John 6. My flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood. If you don't, you won't have life within you. Jesus was pretty radical about this. But even if you feel like you couldn't solve it biblically, if you could say, okay, is he being literal here? Is he being metaphorical? The thing that got me was going and studying the earliest church, I would say Catholics, right at the very beginning, their devotion to the real presence of Christ, and their use of language, of sacrificial language. I did a whole podcast and post on that. But the idea is that we have we have the body of Christ. If I'm just giving a rundown of Catholic theology now, which is the Catholic Church, and the sacraments are sort of the arteries that run through it. They're the primary dispensers of grace, if you will. That God still works through stuff now, even as He did in the Old Testament. He's just kind of continuing His work in the way that He has. And through our cooperation of living the sacramental life in response to God's grace, that is going to help us. That is going to help us to become the kinds of people that other people in heaven will want to be around. That's really the point. It's going to come to help us know and love God. It's going to help us live a life of holiness, or at least strive for a life of holiness. So the point I'm driving with this, and the reason I'm coming from a Catholic position, is that God doesn't leave us orphans in this. He isn't leaving us. He isn't just saying, here's the rules, go and get it done. He's saying, no, I'm here to help you in every possible way that I can. But I just need you to assent to this. I need you to cooperate with this, and I will give you what you need to get it done. I will. And there's many different ways that God's grace acts in our lives. So that is the 10,000-foot view above the tarmac of how I would see this, and how I think is the right way of seeing it, is that it isn't easy. It certainly isn't easy. I mean, there's nothing easy about, especially if you're coming from a position that I was. It was fundamentally narcissistic, egotistical, prideful. I mean, becoming a Catholic just like turned me inside out. That's the weird, mysterious thing, is that, like, in no sense was I achieving that. There is something very much like we've been talking about, God's grace. It was working within me, through the church. that has helped me to live this radically different life that even a year and a half ago I was not living. So it's not easy, but we have help. That's the point. And the key here is that we just have to assent. We have to see that God's will is loving and that he wants what is perfectly good for us. So it doesn't make sense when you understand God theologically and philosophically to then want to go against his will is really, and this is important, I'm going to press this here, is to want what is not really good for you. If you go against God's will, you are wanting something that is not really good for you. Because God is only willing what he knows is really good for you. So if you want what is really good for you, if you want your own happiness, which all of us do, then there's a blueprint. There's like literally a blueprint for that. The problem is pride and narcissism and confusion. We think these finite things is where we're going to find our perfect happiness. And I mean, how many obvious examples do you need to show that this isn't true? All the people in the world who sought all the power in the world, all the money in the world, all the fame in the world, and not only weren't happy, but were flat out miserable, if not, corrupt and evil people because they tried to pursue what really was a good thing in a wrong way, or in a way that wasn't proportionate or properly oriented. So I think that's the right way to see it, to understand that God knows what is really good for us. He's given us a clear path, and he's given us all the available means that we need to pursue this and to live this life. Does that mean that it's still easy? No, it isn't. But God is going to give all of us what we need, so long as we're willing to cooperate with that and live this life. And I will tell you that, a couple of years ago, I would not have believed that. But now, having lived through it, having seen the changes, again, far from a perfectly holy person here. But if we're just comparing apples to apples, if we're comparing Pat Flynn before to Pat Flynn after, it's night and day. I'm not going to compare Pat Flynn to any higher holy saint, at least not at this point. But that's not the important point. The important point is what is the transformation that has occurred inside of me. So that's I think it for today, and that's the few talking points that I think were most relevant to this. This is a really, like I said, a kind and heartwarming email. My dog Lola has to go outside, so I'm going to open the door here for her very quickly before she starts barking into the podcast microphone. She's a St. Bernard. She's got a very loud and powerful bark. Okay, outside you go, Lola. God bless. And so thanks for tuning in, folks. This has been Sunday School. I really do try to read all the emails you send out. So if you have any suggestions or you have any things that you'd like to hear on Sunday School like this, any topics like this, please email me. This feedback is very reaffirming to me. And if you think we're doing good work here and you want to help support the show, all I ask is head over to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, leave a 5-star review. That really helps.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.